question for that topic. Do you feel like you have become someone new through your time in Japan, or did you uncover different layers of who you've always been?
That's a very interesting question. I never thought of it as that way. For me, because I was born in Japan, spent for 6 years in Japan, and also grew up in a Japanese household here in Canada, there's always, I guess, some layers of Japaneseness. There's layers that felt familiar as I was living in Japan.
Question is, have you ever felt completely at home in Japan, yet simultaneously like a foreigner? And how do you navigate the feeling of belonging and not belonging at the same time?
Reading that question, I go, what is home? Like, how do having thought of all of that, became about the fourth year I was in Japan. So, give me a background. As I mentioned, the first 3 years I spent as a JET program participant, which at that time you could only stay on the program for 3 years. After JET, I wanted to stay in Japan, and my employers and a few other people locally helped me find a job with a company. And I had the option of, say, going back to Canada at that time, and I found a job with a university that I worked in. They were more understanding of who I am. I think the other place expected me more Japanese, which at that time I wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
But the university, there were other foreigners working there. My boss he wasn't treating me as Japanese, he was treating me as a Canadian. Of course, he treated everybody the same, but he
Mm-hmm.
recognizes there are certain things that I would appreciate if it could be accommodated. For example, taking Christmas off. So that probably was about 6 months into that job that I felt really, really comfortable. I always felt like a foreigner. I didn't feel like I was fully Japanese, even though for myself, like I could walk down the street, I could go shopping, and I spoke good enough Japanese, maybe that people would not suspect that I was a Canadian. I don't think my neighbors in my apartment complex didn't know that I was a Canadian. They probably thought it was just another Japanese guy. I've never, ever said I'm Japanese. I've always said I am Canadian. That never waived. In Japan, it would have been more or less a nationality thing, your attitude, your upbringing. In Canada, it's definitely a visible aspect.
For my next question,
Yep.
was there a specific moment when you realized you have internalized Japanese culture where it felt more natural than foreign? What did that realization mean to you?
I got this one good story. So when I joined the university, about 3.5 years, 4 years that I was living in Japan, the organization was very, very strictly Japanese. So in the political world in Japan, it's very, very strict. Like the hierarchy is very strict, the mannerism, the protocol compared to here. And he went through that. And when he became the head of the university, he expected everybody to be that way. A lot of like ceremonies. So when I was accepted, like all the board members were there. He was there, and I have to receive this like a document saying that you are being hired by this university, like very very Japanese stuff. And at that, the first thing I have to do there, like they call my name, I stand up and I bow. And at that time, the head of the university, the guy, said, "You're doing it wrong." And so he asked, "I'm going to teach you how to do it," and he did. I wasn't really thinking about that, how it's properly done. But you thought like, all you have to do is just sort of like, make sure that you're looking down, the person to show respect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the time when I realized the importance of that. I'll just make a comparison because when I was living in Canada, it didn't look anything authentic when you're doing that. So I was living in this small mining town. I had a tragedy where one of the Japanese men who immigrated was killed in a mining accident. All the other families helped, like make sure there's a funeral. And a brother came all the way from Japan, first time in Canada, so that he could attend the ceremony. And he was so grateful. He was bowing all the time. And I thought, that's silly. You don't have to do that. We're doing it because of, our friend who passed away. Now I feel like, oh, like I didn't really know anything, like about the culture, the meaning of all of that. It's where I find the importance of especially in Japan, the culture in Japan, with any expats who live in Japan saying like, oh, you've adapted to the Japanese system, is that you're talking to the person on the phone. And when you're cutting off, you're bowing to the person, even though he doesn't see you. It's just natural reaction that you're bowing, oh,
Yeah.
thank you for, arigatou gozaimasu, arigatou gozaimasu. What did the realization mean to you? Again, maybe this is that Japanese side that was under that, the fact that I was born in Japan, lived the first 6 years in Japan, and I grew up in a Japanese household, and now I see how my parents reacted to some certain situations. There's one thing that I probably picked up well is like adapting to the culture.
Do you believe home is something external or something internal that you carry with you? And how has this belief shaped your journey?
I would suspect that you probably, my answer would be internal.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. So we're on the same page. If I didn't decide to go to like Japan, I would have stayed in Canada. Well, chances are I would probably be living in Alberta, or like my parents had moved down to British Columbia, Vancouver area. So it could have been Vancouver or somewhere in between. I would find something there that, would consider, that feel like home. There's a phrase, when in Rome, do what the Romans do. And I tend to be like that. All those places, of course, there was a sense of me, yes, I am an outsider. I found things made me feel like, I belong, or, I could make this home. If none of the places felt like this was something temporary, all the places, I think, once you're there and you're settled down, like, yeah, they do feel like home. So that's sort of like helped me adjust things. And I think, in some ways, right now, I'm in Vancouver area. It's not really a place that I grew up. I've been living here for 12 years now, and it probably feels like home.
So this question is, has speaking Japanese changed the way you express yourself or the way you see yourself? And do you feel like a different person when speaking Japanese versus in English?
Definitely, after living in 20 years in Japan, way I express myself here, there's a lot of overlap with how I used to think or express myself in Japan, in Japanese. How I see myself, it has changed, definitely. The if story, like if I did not decide to go to work in Japan, then I would be basically another Canadian. I would be a different person with a different mindset, different attitude.
Do you find yourself more expressive now or express yourself in a different way? For example, now that after being in Japan for so long and came back to Canada,
Yep.
did you feel like the way you spoke in English had more influence from your mannerisms that you learned when you lived in Japan?
Definitely, yes. Not only the how I speak, but also how I react. My career. I spent more time in Japan than, let's say, in Canada. I feel like a different person when speaking Japanese versus English. Yeah, I say yes. In English, they're more expressive, they're more outgoing, but in Japanese, they tend to be a little bit more reserved. If I do go back to Japan, for example, then I am really, really Japanese. I still have the language, the manners, and the culture that's, that I've sort of learned or absorbed after living there. It also depends on who I'm with. I find that even Japanese who have settled here, they're different from, let's say, the Japanese living in Japan. So there is some sense of Canadianness that they have absorbed. That's my answer.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.